This week we are reading Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud. He had been flesh once, flesh and bone and ambition, but that was an age ago, or so it seemed, and the memory of that blessed state was fading fast. Some traces of his former life remained. Time and exhaustion couldn't take everything from him. He could picture clearly and painfully the faces of those he'd loved and hated. They stared through at him from the past, clear and luminous. He could still see the sweet, good-night expressions in his children's eyes, and the same look, less sweet but no less good-night, in the eyes of the brutes he had murdered. Some of those memories made him want to cry, except there were no tears to be wrung out of his starched eyes. Besides, it was far too late for regret. Regret was a luxury reserved for the living, who still had the time, the breath, and the energy to act. He was beyond all that. He, his mother's little Ronnie, oh, if she could see him now, he was almost 3 weeks dead. Too late for regrets by a long chalk. He'd done all he could do to correct the errors he'd made. He'd spun out his span to its limits and beyond, stealing himself precious time to sew up the loose ends of his frayed existence. Mother's little Ronnie had always been tidied, a paragon of neatness. This was one of the reasons he'd enjoyed accountancy. The pursuit of a few misplaced pence through hundreds of figures was a game he relished, and how satisfying at the end of the day to balance the books. Unfortunately, life was not so perfectible as now, too late in the day, he realized. Still, he'd done his best, and that, as Mother used to say, was all anybody could hope to do. There was nothing left but to confess, and having confessed, to go to his judgment empty-handed and contrite. As he sat draped over the use-shined seat in the confessional box of St. Mary Magdalene's, he fretted that the shape of his usurped body would not hold out long enough for him to burden himself of all the sins that languished in his linen heart. He concentrated, trying to keep body and soul together for these last vital few minutes. Soon Father Rooney would come. He would sit behind the lattice divide of the confessional and offer words of consolation, of understanding, of forgiveness. Then, in the remaining minutes of his stolen existence, Ronnie Glass would tell his story. He would begin by denying that most terrible stain on his character, the accusation of pornographer. Pornographer. The thought was absurd. There wasn't a pornographer's bone in his body. Anyone who had known him in his 32 years would have testified to that. My Christ, he didn't even like sex very much. That was the irony. Of all the people to be accused of peddling filth, he was about the most unlikely. When it seemed everyone about him was parading their adulteries like third legs, he lived a blameless existence. The forbidden life of the body happened, like a car accidents, to other people, not to him. Sex was simply a roller coaster ride that one might indulge in once every year or so. Twice might be tolerable, 3 times nauseating. Was it any surprise, then, that in 9 years of marriage to a good Catholic girl, this good Catholic boy only fathered 2 children? But he'd been a loving man in his listless way, and his wife Bernadette had shared his indifference to sex, so his enthusiastic member had never been a bone to contention between them. And the children were a joy. Samantha was already growing into a model of politeness and tidiness, and Imogen, though scarcely 2, had her mother's smile. Life had been fine all in all. He had almost owned a featureless, semi-detached house in the leafier suburbs of South London. He had possessed a small garden, Sunday tended, a soul to the same. It had been, as far as he could judge, a model life, unassuming and dirt-free. And it would have remained so had it not been for that worm of greed in his nature. Greed had undone him, no doubt. If he hadn't been greedy, he wouldn't have looked twice at the job that Maguire had offered him. He would have trusted the instinct, taken one look around the poky, smoke-filled office above the Hungarian pastry shop in Soho, and turned tail. But his itch for wealth diverted him from the plain truth, that he was using all his skills as an accountant to give gloss of credibility to an operation that stank of corruption. He'd known that in his heart, of course, known that despite Maguire's ceaseless talk of moral rearment, his fondness for his children, his obsession with the gentlemanly art of bonsai, the man was a louse. The lowest of the low. But he'd successfully shut out that knowledge and contented himself with the job at hand, balancing the books. Maguire was generous, and that made the blindness easier to induce. He even began to like the man and his associates. He got used to seeing the shambling bulk that was Dennis Dork-Luzzati, a fresh cream pastry perpetually hovering at his fat lips. Got used to little 3-fingered Henry B. Henry, with his card tricks and his patter, a new routine every day. They weren't the most sophisticated of conversationalists, but they certainly wouldn't have been welcome at the tennis club, but they seemed harmless enough. It was a shock then, a terrible shock, when he eventually drew back the veil and saw Dork, Henry, and Maguire for the beasts they really were. The revelation had occurred by accident. One night, finishing some tax work late, Ronnie had caught a cab down to the warehouse planning to deliver his report to Maguire by hand. He'd never actually visited the warehouse, though he'd heard it mentioned between them often enough. Maguire had been stockpiling his supplies of books there for some months, mostly cookery books from Europe, or so Ronnie had been told. That night, that last night of cleanliness, he walked into the truth in all its full-color glory. Maguire was there in one of the plain brick rooms, sitting on a chair, surrounded by packages and boxes. An unshaded bulb threw a halo on his thinning scalp. It glistened pinkly. Dork was there too, engrossed in a cake. Henry B. was playing patience. Piled high on every side of the trio, there were magazines, thousands upon thousands of them, their covers shining, virginal, and somehow fleshy. Maguire looked up from his calculations. "Glassy," he said. He always used that nickname. Ronnie stared into the room, guessing even from a distance what these heaped treasures were. "Come on in," said Henry B. "Good for a game?" "Don't look so serious," soothed Maguire. "This is just merchandise." A kind of numb horror drew Ronnie to approach one of the stacks of magazines and open the top copy. Climax Erotica, the cover read. Full-color pornography for the discriminating adult. Text in English, German, and French. Unable to prevent himself, he began to look through the magazine, his face stinging with embarrassment, only half hearing the barrage of jokes and threats that Maguire was shooting off. Swarms of obscene images flew out of the pages, horribly abundant. He'd never seen anything like it in his life. Every sexual act possible between consenting adults, and a few only doped acrobats would consent to, were chronicled in glorious detail. The performers in their unspeakable acts smiled glassy-eyed at Ronnie as they swarmed up out of a grease of sex, neither shame nor apology on their lust-filled faces. Every slit, every slot, every pucker and pimple of their bodies was exposed, naked beyond nakedness. The pouting, panting excess of it turned Ronnie's stomach to ash. He closed the magazine and glanced at another pile beside it. Different faces, same furious coupling. Every depravity was catered for somewhere. The titles alone testified to the delights to be found inside. Bizarre Women in Chains, one read. Enslaved by Rubber, another promised. Labrador Lover, a third portrayed in perfect focus down to the last wet whisker. Slowly, Michael Maguire's cigarette-worn voice filtered through into Ronnie's reeling brain. It cajoled or tried to, and worse, it mocked him in its subtle way for his naivete. "You had to find out sooner or later," he said. "I suppose it may as well be sooner, huh? No harm in it. All a bit of fun." Ronnie shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the images that had taken root behind his eyes. They were multiplying already, invading a territory that had been so innocent of such possibilities. In his imagination, Labradors scampered around in leather, drinking from the bodies of bound whores. It was frightening the way these pictures flowed out into his eyes, each page a new abomination. He felt he'd choke on them unless he acted. "Horrible," was all he could say. "Horrible, horrible, horrible." He kicked a pile of bizarre women in chains, and they toppled over, the repeated images of the cover sprawling across the dirty floor. "Don't do that," said Maguire very quietly. "Horrible," said Ronnie. "They're all horrible." "There's a big market for 'em. Not me," he said, as though Maguire was suggesting he had some personal interest in them. "All right, so you don't like him. He doesn't like him. Dork." Dork was wiping cream off his short fingers with a dainty handkerchief. "Why not?" "Too dirty for him." "Horrible," said Ronnie again. "Well, you're up in this to your neck, my son," said Maguire. His voice was the devil's voice, wasn't it? Surely the devil's voice. "You may as well grin and bear it." Dork guffawed. "Grin and bear it. I like it, Mick. I like it." Ronnie looked up at Maguire. The man was 45, maybe 50, but his face had a fretted, cracked look, old before its years. The charm was gone. It was scarcely human. The face he locked eyes with, its sweat, its bristles, its puckered mouth made it resemble, in Ronnie's mind, the proffered backside of one of the red law sluts in the magazines. "We're all known villains here," the organ was saying, "and we've got nothing to lose if we're caught again." "Nothing," said Dork. "Whereas you, my son, you're a spit-clean professional. Way I see it, if you want to go grabbing about this dirty business, you're going to lose your reputation as a nice, honest accountant. In fact, I venture to suggest you'll never work again. You take my meaning?" Ronnie wanted to hit Maguire, so he did. Hard, too. There was a satisfying snap as Maguire's teeth met at speed and blood came quickly from between his lips. It was the first time Ronnie had fought since his school days, and he was slow to avoid the inevitable retaliation. The blow that returned sent him sprawling, bloodied amongst the bizarre women. Before he could clamber to his feet, Dork had slammed his heel into Ronnie's face, grinding the gristle in his nose. While Ronnie blinked back, the blood Dork hoisted him to his feet and held him up as a captive target for McGuire. The ring in hand became a fist, and for the next 5 minutes, McGuire used Ronnie as a punch bag, starting below the belt and working up. Ronnie found the pain curiously reassuring. It seemed to heal his guilty psyche better than a string of Hail Marys. When the beating was over, the Dork had let him out, defaced into the dark. There wasn't any anger left to him, only a need to finish the cleansing McGuire had begun. He went home to Bernadette that night and told her a lie about being mugged in the street. She was so consoling, it made him sick to be deceiving her, but he had no choice. That night and the night after were sleepless. He lay in his own bed just a few feet from that of his trusting spouse and tried to make sense of his feelings. He knew in his bones the truth would go sooner or later, become public knowledge. Better surely to go to the police, come clean. But that took courage, and his heart never felt weaker. So he prevaricated through the Thursday night and Friday, letting the bruises yellow and the confusion settle. Then, on Sunday, shit hit the fan. The lowest of the Sunday filth sheets had his face in the front cover, complete with banner headline, "The Sex Empire Ronald Glass." Inside were photographs snatched from innocent circumstance and construed as guilt. Glass appearing to look pursued, Glass appearing to look devious. His natural hirsuteness made him seem ill-shaven. His neat haircut suggested the prison aesthetic favored by some of the criminal fraternity. Being short-sighted, he squinted. Photographed squinting, he looked like a lustful rat. He stood in the news agent staring at his own face and knew his personal Armageddon was on the horizon. Shaking, he read the terrible titles and lies inside. Somebody he never exactly worked out who had told the whole story. The pornography, the brothels, the sex shops, the cinemas, the secret world of smut that McGuire had masterminded was here detailed in every sordid particular, except that McGuire's name did not appear. Neither did Dork's, nor Henry's. It was Glass. Glass all the way. His guilt was transparent. He had been framed neat as anything. A corrupter of children, the leader called him. Little boy blue, grown fat and horny. It was too late to deny anything. By the time he got back to the house, Bernadette was gone with the children in tow. Somebody had got her in the news, probably salivating down the phone, delighting with the sheer dirt of it. He stood in the kitchen where the table was laid for a breakfast the family hadn't eaten and would now never eat, and he cried. Not a great deal. His supply of tears was strictly limited, but enough to feel the duty done. Then, having finished with his gesture of remorse, he sat down like any decent man who was deeply wronged and planned murder. In many ways, getting the gun was more difficult than anything that followed. It required some careful thought, some soft words, and a good deal of hard cash. It took him a day and a half to locate the weapon he wanted and to learn how to use it. Then, in his own good time, he went about his business. Henry B. died first. Ronnie shot him in his own striped pinewood kitchen in up-and-coming Islington. He had a cup of freshly brewed coffee in his three-fingered hand and a look of almost pitiable terror on his face. The first shot struck him in the side, denting his shirt and causing a little blood to come. Far less than Ronnie had been steeling himself for, however. More confident, he fired again. The second shot hit his intended, in the neck, and that seemed to be the killer. Henry B. pitched forward like a comedian in a silent movie, not relinquishing the coffee cup until the moment before he hit the floor. The cup spun in the mingled dregs of coffee and life and rattled, at last, to a halt. Ronnie stepped over to the body and fired a third shot straight through the back of Henry B.'s neck. The last bullet was almost casual, swift and accurate. Then he escaped easily out of the back gate, almost elated by the ease of the act. He felt as though he'd cornered and killed a rat in his cellar, an unpleasant duty that needed to be done. The frisson lasted 5 minutes, then he was profoundly sick. Anyway, that was Henry, all out of tricks. Dork's death was rather more sensational. He ran out of time at the dog track. Indeed, he was showing Ronnie his winning ticket when he felt the long-bladed knife insinuate itself between his fourth and fifth ribs. He could scarcely believe he was being murdered. The expression on his pastry-fattened face was one of complete amazement. He kept looking from side to side at the punters milling around, as though at any moment one of them would point and laugh and tell him this was all a joke, a premature birthday game. Then Ronnie twisted the blade in the wound. He'd read that this was surely lethal, and Dork realized that, winning ticket or not, this wasn't his lucky day. His heavy body was carried along the crush of the crowd for a good 10 yards until it became wedged in the teeth of the turnstile. Only then did someone feel the hot gush from Dork and scream. By then, Ronnie was well away. Content, feeling cleaner by the hour, he went back to the house. Bernadette had been in, collecting clothes and favorite ornaments. He wanted to say to her, "Take everything. It means nothing to me," but she'd slipped in and gone again like a ghost of a housewife. In the kitchen, the table was still set for that final Sunday breakfast. There was dust on the cornflakes in the children's bowls. The rancid butter was beginning to grease the air. Ronnie sat through the late afternoon, through the dusk, through until the early hours of the following morning and tasted his newfound power over life and death. Then he went to bed in his clothes, no longer caring to be tidy, and slept the sleep of the almost good. It wasn't so hard for McGuire to guess who'd wasted Dork and Henry B. Henry, though the idea of that particular worm turning was hard to swallow. Many of the criminal community had known Ronald Glass, had laughed with McGuire over the little deception that was being played upon the innocent, but no one had believed him capable of such extreme sanctions against his enemies. In some seedier quarters, he was now being saluted for his sheer bloody-mindedness. Others, McGuire included, had felt he had gone too far to be welcomed into the fold like a strayed sheep. The general opinion was that he be dispatched before he did any more damage to the fragile balance of power. So Ronnie's days became numbered. They would have been counted on the 3 fingers of Henry B.'s hand. They came for him on Saturday afternoon and took him quickly, without him having time to wield a weapon in his defense. They escorted him to a salami and cooked meats warehouse, and in the icy white safety of the cold storage room, they hung him from a hook and tortured him. Anyone with any claim to Dork's or Henry B.'s affections was given an opportunity to work out their grief on him. With knives, with hammers, with oxyacetylene torches, they shattered his knees and his elbows. They put out his eardrums, burned the flesh off the soles of his feet. Finally, about 11 or so, they began to lose interest. The clubs were just getting into their rhythm. The gambling tables were beginning to simmer. It was time to be done with justice and get out of the town. That was when Mickey McGuire arrived, dressed to kill in his best bib and tucker. Ronnie knew he was there somewhere in the haze, but his senses were all but out, and he only half saw the gun leveled at his head, half felt the noise of the blast bounce around the white-tiled room. A single bullet, immaculately placed, entered his brain through the middle of his forehead, as neat as he could even have wished, like a third eye. His body twitched on his hook a moment and died. McGuire took applause like a man, kissed the ladies, thanked his dear friends who had seen this deed done with him, and went to play. The body was dumped in a black plastic bag in the edge of Epping Forest early on Saturday morning, just as the dawn chorus was tuning up the ash trees and the sycamores. And that, to all intents and purposes, was the end of all that. Except that it was the beginning. Ronnie's body was found by a jogger out before 7 on the following Monday. In the day between his being dumped and being found, his corpse had already begun to deteriorate. But the pathologist had seen far, far worse. He watched dispassionately while the 2 mortuary technicians stripped the body, folded the clothes, and placed them in tagged plastic bags. He waited patiently and attentively while the wife of the deceased was ushered into his echoing domain, her face ashen, her eyes swelled to bursting with too many tears. She looked down at her husband without love, staring at the wounds and the marks of torture quite unflinchingly. The pathologist had a whole story written behind this last confrontation between sex king and untroubled wife. Their loveless marriage, their arguments over his despicable way of life, her despair, his brutality, and now her relief that the torment was finally over and she was released to start a new life without him. The pathologist made a mental note to look up the pretty widow's address. She was delicious in her indifference to mutilation. It made his mouth wet to think of her. Ronnie knew Bernadette had come and gone. He could sense, too, the other faces that popped into the mortuary just to peer down at the sex king. He was an object of fascination, even in death, and it was a horror he hadn't predicted, buzzing around in the cool coils of his brain, like a tenant who refuses to be ousted by the bailiffs, still seeing the world hovering around him and not being able to act upon it. In the days since his death, there had been no hint of escape from his condition. He sat here in his own dead skull, unable to find a way out of the living world and unwilling, somehow, to relinquish life entirely and leave himself to heaven. There was still a will to revenge on him. A part of his mind, unforgiving to trespasses, was prepared to postpone paradise in order to finish the job he had shared. The books needed balancing, and until Michael McGuire was dead, Ronnie would not go to his atonement. In his round-bone prison, he watched the curious come and go, then nodded up his will. The pathologist did his work on Ronnie's corpse with all the respect of an efficient fish gutter, carelessly digging the bullet out of his cranium and nosing around the stews of smashed bone and cartilage that had formerly been his knees and elbows. Ronnie didn't like the man. He leered at Bernadette in a highly unprofessional way when he was playing the professional. His callousness was positively shameful. Oh, for a voice, for a fist, for a body to use for a time. Then he'd show this meat merchant how bodies should be treated. The will was not enough, though. It needed a focus and a means of an escape. The pathologist finished his report and his rough sewing, flung his shiny gloves and his stained instruments onto the trolley beside the swabs and the alcohol, and left the body to the assistants. Ronnie heard the swing doors close behind him as the man departed. Water was running somewhere, splashing into the sink, and the sound irritated him. Standing beside the table on which he lay, the two technicians discussed their shoes. Of all things, shoes. The banality of it, thought Ronnie, the life-decaying banality of it. You know them new heels, Lenny? The ones I got to put on my brown suedes? Useless. No bleeding good at all. I'm not surprised. And the price I paid for them? Look at that. Just look at that. Worn through in a month. Paper thin. They are, Lenny. They're paper thin. I'm going to take them back. I would. I would. This mindless conversation after those hours of torture, of sudden death, of the post-mortem that he'd so recently endured was almost beyond endurance. Ronnie's spirit began to buzz around and round in his brain like an angry bee trapped in an upturned jam jar, determined to get out and start stinging. Round and round like the conversation. Paper bloody thin. I'm not surprised. Bloody foreign, these shoes, made in fucking Korea. Korea? That's why they're paper thin. It was unforgivable, the trudging stupidity of these people, that they should live and act and be, while he buzzed on and on, boiling with frustration. Was that fair? Neat shot, eh, Lenny? What? The stiff. Old what's-his-name, the sex king, bang in the middle of the forehead. See that? Pop goes the weasel. Lenny's companion, it seemed, was still preoccupied with his paper-thin soul. He didn't reply. Lenny inquisitively inched back the shroud of Ronnie's forehead. The lines of sawn and scalped flesh were inelegantly sewn, but the bullet hole itself was neat. Look at it. The other glanced round at the dead face. The head wound had been cleaned after the probing pinchers had work on it. The edges were white and puckered. I thought they usually went for the heart, said the soul searcher. This wasn't any street fight. It was an execution, formal-like, said Lenny, poking his little finger into the wound. It's a perfect shot. Bang in the middle of the forehead, like he had 3 eyes. Yeah. The shroud was tossed back over Ronnie's face. The bee buzzed on round and round. You hear about third eyes, don't you? Do you? Stella read me something about it being the center of the body. That's your navel. How can your forehead be the center of your body? Well, that's your navel. No, it's more your spiritual center. The other didn't deign to respond. Just about where this bullet hole is, said Lenny, still lost in admiration for Ronnie's killer. The bee listened. The bullet hole was just one of many holes in his life. Holes where his wife and children should have been, holes winking up at him like sightless eyes from the pages of the magazines, pink and brown and hair flipped. Holes to the right of him, holes to the left. Could it be at last that he found here a hole that he could profit by? Why not leave by the wound? His spirit braced itself and made for his brow, creeping through his cortex with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. Ahead he could sense the exit door like a light at the end of a long tunnel. Beyond the hole, the warp and weft of his shroud glittered like a promised land. His sense of direction was good. The light grew as he crept. His voices became louder. Without fanfare, Ronnie's spirit spat itself into the outside world, a tiny seepage of soul. The motes of fluid that carried his will and his consciousness were soaked up by his shroud like tears by tissues. His flesh and blood body were utterly deserted now, an icy bulk fit for nothing but the flames. Ronnie Glass existed in a new world, a white linen world like no state he had lived or dreamed before. Ronnie Glass was in his shroud. Had Ronnie's pathologist not been forgetful, he wouldn't have come back into the mortuary at that moment, trying to locate the diary he'd written the Widow Glass's number in. And had he not come in, he would have lived. As it was. Haven't you started on this one yet? He snapped at the technicians. They murmured some apology or other. He was always testy at this time of night. They were used to his tantrums. Get on with it, he said, stripping the shroud off the body and flinging it on the floor in irritations, before the fucker walks out of here in disgust. Don't want to get our little hotel a bad reputation, do we? Yes, sir. No, sir. Well, don't stand there. Parcel it up. There's a widow wants him dispatched as soon as possible. I've seen it all I need to see from him. Ronnie lay on the floor in a crumpled heap, slowly spreading his influence through his newfound land. It felt good to have a body, even if it was sterile and rectangular. Bringing a power of will to bear he hadn't known he possessed, Ronnie took full control of the shroud. At first it refused life. It had always been passive. That was its condition. It wasn't used to occupation by spirits. But Ronnie wasn't to be beaten now. His will was an imperative. Against all rules of natural behavior, it stretched and knotted the sullen linen into a semblance of life. The shroud rose. The pathologist had located his little black book and was in the act of pocketing it when this white curtain spread itself in his path, stretching like a man who had just woken from a deep sleep. Ronnie tried to speak, but the only voice he could find was a whisper of the cloth in the air, too tight, too light, too insubstantial to be heard over the complaints of frightened men. And frightened they were. Despite the pathologist's calls for assistance, none was forthcoming. Lenny and his companion were sliding away towards the swing doors, gaping mouths, babbling entreaties to any local god who would listen. Pathologist backed off against the post-mortem table, quite out of the gods. "Get out of my sight," he said. Ronnie embraced him tightly. "Help," said the pathologist, almost to himself. But help was gone. It was running down the corridor, still babbling, keeping its back to the miracle that was taking place in the mortuary. The pathologist was alone, wrapped up in his starched embrace, murmuring at the last some apologies he had found beneath his pride. "I'm sorry, whoever you are. Whatever you are, I'm sorry." But there was an anger in Ronnie that could not have truck with late converts. No pardons or reprieves were available. This fish-eyed bastard, this son of the scalpel, had cut and examined his old body as though it was a side of beef. It made Ronnie livid to think of this creep's oh-so-cool appraisal of life, death, and Bernadette. The bastard would die here amongst his remains, and let that be an end to his callous profession. The corners of the shroud were forming into crude arms now as Ronnie's memory shaped them. It seemed natural to recreate his old appearance in this new medium. He made hands first, then digits, even a rudimentary thumb. He was like a morbid atom raised out of linen. Even as they formed, the hands had the pathologist about the neck. As yet they had no sense in touching them, and it was difficult to judge how hard to press in the throbbing skin, so he simply used all the strength he could muster. The man's face blackened, and his tongue, the color of plum, stuck out of his mouth like a spearhead, sharp and hard. In his enthusiasm, Ronnie broke his neck. It snapped suddenly, and the head fell backwards at a horrid angle. The vain apologies had long since stopped. Ronnie dropped him to the polished floor and stared down at the hands he'd made, with eyes that were still 2 pinpricks in the sheet of stained cloth. He felt certain of himself and this body, and God, he was strong. He'd broken the bastard's neck without exerting himself at all. Occupying this strange bloodless physique had a new freedom of the constraints of humanity. He was alive suddenly to the life of the air, feeling it now fill and billow him. Surely he could fly like a sheet in the wind, or if it suited him, knot himself into a fist and beat the world into submission. The prospect seemed endless. And yet, he sensed that this possession was at best temporary. Sooner or later, the shroud would want to resume its former life as an idle piece of cloth, and its true passive nature would be restored. This body had not been given to him, merely loaned. It was up to him to use it to the best of his vengeful abilities. He knew the priorities. First and foremost, to find Michael McGuire and dispatch him. Then, if he still had the time left, he would go see the children. But it wasn't wise to go visiting as a flying shroud. Better by far to work at this illusion of humanity and see if he could sophisticate the effect. He'd seen what freak creases could do, making faces appear in a crumbled pillow or in the folds of a jacket hanging on the back of the door. More extraordinary still, there was the Shroud of Turin, in which the face and body of Jesus Christ had been miraculously imprinted. Bernadette had been sent a postcard of the shroud, with every wound and lance and nail in place. Why couldn't he make the same miracle, by force of will? Wasn't he resurrected too? He went to the sink in the morgue and turned off the running tap, then stared into the mirror to watch his will take shape. The surface of the shroud was already twitching and scurrying as he demanded new forms of it. At first there was only the primitive outline of his head, roughly shaped like that of a snowman. 2 pits for eyes, a lump and nose. But he concentrated, willing the linen to stretch itself to the limits of its elasticity. And behold! It worked! It really worked! The threads complained but acquiesced to his demands, forming in exquisite reproduction the nostrils, then the eyelids, the upper lip, now the lower. He traced from memory the contours of his lost face like an adoring lover, and remade them in every detail. Now he began to make a column for the neck, filled with air, but looking deceptively solid. Below that, the shroud swelled into a manly torso. The arms were already formed, the legs followed quickly on, and it was done. He was remade in his own image. The illusion was not perfect. For one thing, he was pure white, except for the stains, and his flesh had the texture of cloth. The creases in his face were perhaps too severe, almost cubist in appearance, and it was impossible to coax the cloth to make a semblance of either hair or nails. But he was as ready for the world as any living shroud could hope to be. It was time to go out and meet his public. "Your game, Mickey." McGuire seldom lost at poker. He was too clever, and that used face too unreadable. His tired, bloodshot eyes never let anything out. Yet, despite his formidable reputation as a winner, he never cheated. That was his bond with himself. There was no lift in winning if there was a cheat involved. It was just stealing then, and that was for criminal classes. He was a businessman, pure and simple. Tonight, in the space of 2.5 hours, he pocketed a tidy sum. Life was good. Since the deaths of Doric Henry and Glass, the police had been too concerned with murder to take much notice in the lower orders of vice. Besides, their palms were too well crossed with silver. They had nothing to complain about. Inspector Wall, a drinking companion of many years' standing, had even offered McGuire protection from the lunatic killer who was apparently on the loose. The irony of the idea pleased McGuire mightily. It was almost 3 a.m., time for bad girls and boys to be in their beds, dreaming of crimes for the morrow. McGuire rose from the table, signifying the end of the night's gambling. He buttoned up his waistcoat and carefully reknotted his lemon water ice silk tie. "Another game next week?" he suggested. The defeated players agreed. They were used to losing money to their boss, but there were no hard feelings amongst the quarter. There was a tinge of sadness, perhaps. They missed Henry B. and Dork. Saturday nights had been such joyous affairs. Now there was a muted tone over the proceedings. Pearl Gut was the first to leave, stubbing out his cheroot in the brimming ashtray. "Night, Mick. Night, Frank. Give the kids a kiss from their Uncle Mick, eh? Will do." Pearl Gut shuffled off with his stuttering brother in tow. Good night." "Night, Ernest." The brothers clattered down the stairs. Norton was the last to go, as always. "Shipment tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow's Sunday," said McGuire. He never worked on Sundays. It was a day for the family. "Not today's Sunday," said Norton, not trying to be pedantic, just letting it come naturally. "Tomorrow's Monday." "Yes. Shipment Monday? I hope so. You going to the warehouse?" "Probably." "I'll pick you up then. We can run down together." "Fine." Norton was a good man, humorless but reliable. "Night then." "Night." His 3-inch heels were steel-tipped. They sounded like a woman's stiletto on the stairs. The door slammed below. McGuire counted his profits, drained his glass of Cointreau, and switched out the light in the gaming room. The smoke was already staling. Tomorrow he'd have to get somebody to come up and open the window. Let some fresh Soho smells in there. Salami and coffee beans, commerce and sleaze. He loved it. Loved it with a passion, like a babe loves a tit. As he descended the stairs into the darkened sex shop, he heard the exchange of farewells in the street outside, followed by the slamming of car doors and the purring departure of expensive cars. A good night with good friends. What more can any man reasonably ask? At the bottom of the stairs, he stopped for a moment. The blinking street sign lights opposite illuminated the shop sufficiently for him to make out the rows of magazine. Their plastic-bound faces glinted. Silicone breast and Spanx buttocks swelled from the covers like overripe fruit. Faces dripping mascara pounded at him, offering every lonely satisfaction paper could promise. But he was unmoved. The time had long since passed when he found any of that stuff of interest. It was simply currency to him. He was neither disgusted nor aroused by it. He was a happily married man, after all, with a wife whose imagination barely stretched beyond page 2 of the Kama Sutra, and whose children were slapped soundly if they spoke one questionable word. In the corner of the shop where the bondage and domination material was displayed, something rose from the floor. McGuire found it hard to focus in the intermittent light. Red, blue, red, blue. But it wasn't Norton, nor one of the Pearl Guts. It was a face he knew, however, smiling at him against the background of roped and raped magazines. Now he saw. It was Glass, clear as day, and despite the colored lights, white as a sheet. He didn't try to reason how a dead man could be staring at him. He just dropped his coat and jaw and ran. The door was locked and the key was on one of 24 on his ring. Oh, Jesus, why did he have so many keys? Keys to the warehouse, keys to the greenhouse, keys to the whorehouse, and only that twitching light to see them by. Red, blue, red, blue. He rummaged amongst the keys, and by some magical chance, the first he tried slotted easily into the lock and turned like a finger in hot grease. The door was open, the street ahead. But Glass glided up behind him soundlessly, and before he could step over the threshold, he had thrown something around McGuire's face, a cloth of some kind. It smelt of hospitals, of ether or disinfectant, or both. McGuire tried to cry out, but a fist of cloth was being thrust down his throat. He gagged on it, the vomit reflex making his system revolt. In response, the assassin just tightened his grip. In the street opposite, a girl McGuire knew only as Natalie, model seeks interesting position with strict disciplinarian, was watching the struggle in the doorway of the shop with a doped look on her vapid face. She'd seen murder once or twice. She'd seen rape aplenty, and she wasn't about to get involved. Besides, it was late and the insides of her thighs ached. Casually, she turned away down the pink-lit corridor, leaving the violence to take its course. McGuire made a mental note to have the girl's face carved up one of these days, if he survived, which seemed less likely by the moment. The red blue was unfixable now, and his airless brain went colorblind, and though he seemed to snatch a grip on a would-be assassin, the hold seemed to evaporate, leaving empty cloth, running through his sweating hands like silk. Then someone spoke, not behind him, not the voice of an assassin, but in front, in the street. Norton. It was Norton. He'd returned for some reason, God love him, and he was getting out of his car 10 yards down the street, shouting McGuire's name. The assassin's chokehold faltered, and gravity claimed McGuire. He fell heavily, the world spinning to the pavement, his face purple in the lurid light. Norton ran towards his boss, fumbling for his gun amongst the bric-a-brac in his pocket. The white-suited assassin was already backing down the street, unprepared to take on another man. He looked, thought Norton, for all the world like a failed member of the Ku Klux Klan, a hood, a robe, a cloak. Norton dropped to one knee, took a double-handed aim at the man, and fired. The result was startling. The figure seemed to balloon up, his body losing its shape, becoming a flapping mass of white cloth with a face loosely imprinted on it. There was a noise like the snapping of Monday-washed sheets on a line, a sound that was out of place in this grimy back street. Norton's confusion left him responseless for a moment, and the man's sheet seemed to rise in the air illusory. At Norton's feet, McGuire was coming round, groaning. He was trying to speak, but having difficulty making himself understood through his bruised larynx and throat. Norton bent closer to him. He smelled of vomit and fear. "Glass," he seemed to be saying. It was enough. Norton nodded and said, "Hush." That was the face, of course, on the sheet. Glass, the imprudent accountant. He'd watched the man's feet fried, watched the whole vicious ritual, not to his taste at all. Well, Ronnie Glass had some friends, apparently. Friends not above revenge. Norton looked up, but the wind had lifted the ghost above the rooftops and away. That had been a bad experience, the first taste of failure. Ronnie remembered it still, the desolation of that night. He'd lain heaped in a rat-run corner of a derelict factory south of the river and calmed the panic in his fibers. What good was this trick he'd mastered if he lost control of it the instant he was threatened? He must plan more carefully and wind his will up until it could brook no resistance. Already he sensed that his energy was ebbing, and there was a hint of difficulty in restructuring his body the second time around. He had no time to waste with fumbled failures. He must corner the man where he could not possibly escape. Police investigations at the mortuary had led round in circles for half a day, and now into the night Inspector Wall of the Yard had tried every technique he knew. Soft words, hard words, promises, threats, seductions, surprises, even blows. Still Lenny told the same story, a ridiculous story he swore could be corroborated when his fellow technician came out of the catatonic state he'd now taken refuge in. But there was no way the inspector would take the story seriously. A shroud that walked? How could he put that in his report? No, he wanted something concrete, even if it was a lie. "Can I have a cigarette?" asked Lenny for the umpteenth time. Wall shook his head. "Hey, Fresno," Wall addressed his right-hand man, Al Kincaid. "I think it's time you searched the lad again." Lenny knew what another search implied. It was euphemism for beating. Up against the walls, legs spread, hands on head. Wham! His stomach jumped at the thought. "Listen," he implored. "What, Lenny?" "I didn't do it." "Of course you did it," said Wall, picking his nose. "We just want to know why. Didn't you like the old fucker? Make dirty remarks about your lady friends, did he? He had a bit of reputation, for what I understand." Al Fresco smirked. "Was that why you nobbled him?" "For God's sake," said Lenny, "you'd think I'd tell you a fucking story like that if I didn't see it with my own fucking eyes." "Language," chided Fresco. "Shrouds don't fly," said Wall with an understandable conviction. "Then where's the shroud, eh?" reasoned Lenny. "You incinerate it. You ate it. How the fuck should I know?" "Language," said Lenny quietly. The phone rang before Fresco could hit him. He picked it up and spoke and handed it to Wall. Then he hit Lenny a friendly slap that drew a little blood. "Listen," said Fresco, breathing with lethal proximity to Lenny as if to suck the air out of his mouth. "We know you did it, see? You were the only one in the morgue alive to do it, see? We just want to know why. That's all. Just why." "Fresco." Wall had covered the receiver as he spoke to the muscle man. "Yes, sir." "It's Mr. McGuire." "Mr. McGuire?" "Mickey McGuire." Fresco nodded. "He's very upset." "Oh, yeah? Why's that?" "He thinks he's been attacked by the man in the morgue, the pornographer." "Glass," said Lenny. "Ronnie Glass." "Ronald Glass, like the man says," said Wall, grinning at Lenny. That's ridiculous, said Fresco. Well, I think we ought to do our duty to an upstanding member of the community, don't you? Duck into the morgue, will you? Make sure that the bastard's still down there. Oh. Fresco exited, confused but obedient. Lenny didn't understand any of this, but he was past caring. What the hell was it to him anyway? He started to play with his balls through a hole in his left-hand pocket. Wall watched him with disdain. Don't do that, he said. You can play with yourself as much as you like once we've got you tucked up in a nice warm cell. Lenny shook his head slowly, removed his hand from his pocket. Just wasn't his day. Fresco was already back from down the hall, a little breathless. He's there, he said, visibly brightened by the simplicity of the task. Of course he is, said Wall. Dead as a dodo, said Fresco. What's a dodo? Asked Lenny. Fresco looked blank. Turn a phrase, he said testily. Wall of the yard was back in line, talking to McGuire. The man at the other end sounded well spooked, and his reassurances seemed to do little good. He's all present and correct, Mickey. You must have been mistaken. How? Well, that's fun. Fuck me. Guess I can't sit like that anymore. Okay. Wall of the yard was back on the line talking to McGuire. The man at the other end sounded well spooked, and his reassurances seemed to do little good. He's all present and correct, Mickey. You must have been mistaken. McGuire's fear ran back through the phone line like a mild electric charge. I saw him, damn you. Well, he's lying down there with a hole in the middle of his head, Mickey, so tell me, how can you have seen him? I don't know, said McGuire. Well then, listen. If you get the chance, drop by, will you? Same arrangement as usual. I could put some nice work your way. Wall didn't like talking business on the phone. It made him uneasy. Later, Mickey. Okay, call by? I will. Promise? Yes. Wall put down the receiver and stared at the suspect. Lenny was back to pocket billiards again. Crass little animal. Another search was clearly called for. Fresco, said Wall in dove-like tones. Will you please teach Lenny not to play with himself in front of police officers? In his fortress in Richmond, McGuire cried like a baby. He'd seen Glass, no doubt of it. Whatever Wall believed about this body being in the mortuary, he knew otherwise. Glass was out on the street, footloose and fancy-free, despite the fact that he'd blown a hole in the bastard's head. McGuire was a God-fearing man, and he believed in life after death, though until now he'd never questioned how it could come about. This was the answer. This blank-faced son of a whore, stinking of ether, this was the way the afterlife would be. It made him weep, fearing to live and fearing to die. It was well past dawn now, a peaceful Sunday morning. Nothing but happened to him in the safety of the Ponderosa and in full daylight. This was his castle, built with his hard-worn thievings. Norton was here, armed to the teeth. There were dogs at every gate. Not one, living or dead, would dare challenge his supremacy in this territory. Here, amongst the portraits of his heroes, Lewis B. Mayer, Dillinger, Churchill, amongst his family, amidst his good taste, his money, his objet d'art, he was his own man. If the mad accountant came for him, he'd be blasted in his tracks, ghost or no ghost, fini. After all, wasn't he, Michael Roscoe McGuire, an empire builder? Born with nothing, he'd risen by virtue of his stockbroker's face and of Maverick's heart. Once in a while, maybe, and only under very controlled conditions, he might let his darker appetites show at the execution of Glass. He'd taken genuine pleasure in that little scenario, the coup de grace, the infinite compassion of the killing stroke. But his life of violence was all but behind him now. Now he was a bourgeoisie secure in his fortress. Raquel woke at 8 and busied herself with prepping breakfast. You want anything to eat? She asked McGuire. He shook his head. His throat hurt too much. Coffee? Yes. You want it in here? He nodded. He liked sitting in front of the window and overlooked the lawn and the greenhouse. The day was brightening. Fat, fleecy clouds bucked the wind, their shadows passing over the perfect green. Maybe he'd take up painting, he thought, like Winston. Commit his favorite landscapes to canvas, maybe a view of the garden, even a nude of Raquel, immortalized in oils before her tits sagged beyond all hope of support. She was back, purring at his side with the coffee. You okay? She asked. Dumb bitch. Of course he wasn't okay. Sure, he said. You've got a visitor. What? He sat straight in the leather chair. Who? She was smiling at him. Tracy, she said. She wants to come in and cuddle. He expelled a hiss of air from the sides of his mouth. Dumb bitch. You want to see Tracy? Sure. The little accident, as he was fond of calling her, was at the door, still in her dressing gown. Hi, Daddy. Hello, sweetheart. She sashayed across the room towards him, her mother's walk in embryo. Mummy says you're ill. I'm getting better. I'm glad. So am I. Shall we go out today? Maybe. See the fair? Maybe. She pouted fetchingly, perfectly in control of the effect. Raquel's trick all over again. He just hoped to God she wasn't going to grow up as dumb as her mother. We'll see, he said, hoping to imply yes, but knowing he meant no. She hoisted herself onto his knee, and he indulged her tales of a 5-year-old's mischiefs for a while, then sent her packing. Talking made his throat hurt, and he didn't feel much of the loving father today. Alone again, he watched the shadows waltz on the lawn. The dogs began to bark after 11. Then after a short while they fell silent. He got up to find Norton, who was in the kitchen doing a jigsaw with Tracy. The hay wain in 2,000 pieces, one of Raquel's favorites. You check the dogs, Norton? No, boss. Well, fucking do it. He didn't often swear in front of the child, but he felt ready to go bang. Norton snapped to it. As he opened the back door, McGuire could smell the day. It was tempting to step outside the house, but the dogs barked in a way that set his head thumping and his palms prickling. Tracy had her head down in the business of the jigsaw, her body tense with anticipation of her father's anger. He said nothing, but went straight back to the lounge. From his chair, he could see Norton striding across the lawn. The dogs weren't making a sound now. Norton disappeared from sight behind the greenhouse. A long wait. McGuire was just beginning to get agitated, when Norton appeared again and looked up at the house, shrugging at McGuire and speaking. McGuire unlocked the sliding door, opened it, and stepped into the patio. The day met him, balmy. What are you saying? He called to Norton. The dogs are fine, Norton returned. McGuire felt his body relax. Of course the dogs were okay. Why shouldn't they bark a bit? What else were they for? He was damn near making a fool of himself, pissing his pants just because the dogs barked. He nodded to Norton and stepped off the patio into the lawn. Beautiful day, he thought. Quickening his pace, he crossed the lawn to the greenhouse, where his carefully nurtured bonsai trees bloomed. At the door of the greenhouse, Norton was waiting dutifully, going through his pockets looking for mints. You want me here, sir? No. Sure? Sure, he said magnanimously. You go back up and play with the kid. Norton nodded. Dogs are fine, he said. Again. Yeah. Must have been the wind stirred them up. There was a wind, warm but strong. It stirred the line of copper beeches that bounded the garden. They shimmered and showed the paler undersides of their leaves to the sky, their movement reassuring in its ease and gentility. McGuire unlocked the greenhouse and stepped into his haven. Here in his artificial Eden were his true loves, nurtured on coos and cuttlefish manure. His sergeant's juniper that had survived the rigors of Mount Ishizuchi, his flowering quince, his yedo spruce, Pichia jessonis, his favorite dwarf that he trained, after several failed attempts, to cling to a stone. All beauties, all minor miracles of winding trunk and cascading needles, worthy of his fondest attention. Content, mindless for a while of the outside world, he pottered amongst his flora. The dogs had fought over possession of Ronnie as though he were a plaything. They'd caught him up, breaching the wall, and surrounded him before he could make his escape, grinning as they seized him, tore him, and spat him out. He escaped only because Norton had approached and distracted them from their fury for a moment. His body was torn in several places after their attack. Confused, concentrating to try keep his shape coherent, he was narrowly avoided being spotted by Norton. Now he crept out of hiding. The fight had sapped him of energy, and the shroud gaped so that the illusion of substance was spoiled. His belly was torn open, his left leg all but severed. The stains had multiplied, mucus and dog shit joining the blood. But the will was all. He had come so close. This was not the time to relinquish his grip and let nature take its course. He existed in mutiny against nature. That was his state, and for the first time in his life and death he felt an elation. To be unnatural and to be in defiance of system and sanity, was that so bad? He was shitty, bloody, dead, and resurrected in a piece of stained cloth. He was nonsense. Yet he was. No one could deny him being as long as he had the will to be. The thought was delicious, like finding a new sense in a blind, deaf world. He saw McGuire in the greenhouse and watched him a while. The enemy was totally absorbed in his hobby. He was even whistling the national anthem as he tended his flowering charges. Ronnie moved closer to the glass and closer, his voice an oh so gentle moan of in the failing weave. McGuire didn't hear the sigh of cloth in the window until Ronnie's face pressed flat to the glass, the features smeared and misshapen. He dropped the yellow spruce. It shattered on the floor, its branches broken. McGuire tried to yell, but all he could squeeze from his vocal cords was a strangled yelp. He broke for the door as the face, huge with greed for revenge, broke the glass. McGuire didn't quite comprehend what happened next, the way the head and body seemed to flow through the broken pain, defying physics, and resembled in his sanctum, taking up the shape of a human being. No, it wasn't quite human. It had the look of a stroke victim. Its white mask, its white body sagged down on the right side. It dragged its torn leg after it as it lunged at him. He opened the door and retreated into the garden. The thing followed, speaking now, arms extended toward him. McGuire. It said his name in a voice so soft he might have imagined it, but no, it spoke again. Recognized me, McGuire? It said. And of course he did. Even with his stroke-stricken, billowing features, it was clearly Ronnie Glass. Glass, he said. Yes, said the ghost. I don't want, McGuire began, then faltered. What didn't he want? To speak with his horror, certainly. To know that it existed, that too. To die, most of all. I don't want to die. You will, said the ghost. McGuire felt the gust of the sheet as it flew in his face, or perhaps as the wind that caught his insubstantial monster and threw it around him. Whichever, the embrace stank of ether and disinfectant and death. Arms of linen tightened around him. The gaping face was pressed onto his, as though the thing wanted to kiss him. Instinctively, McGuire reached round his attacker, and his hands found the rent the dogs had made in the shroud. His fingers gripped the open edge of the cloth, and he pulled. He was satisfied to hear the linen tearing along its weave, and the bear hug fell away from him. The shroud bucked in his hand, the liquefied mouth wide in a silent scream. Ronnie was feeling in agony. He thought he'd left behind him with flesh and bone, but there it was again. Pain, pain, pain. He fluttered away from his mutilator, letting out what cry he could, while McGuire stumbled away up the lawn, his eyes huge. The man was close to madness. Surely his mind was as good as broken. But that wasn't enough. He had to kill the bastard. That was his promise to himself, and he intended to keep it. The pain didn't disappear, but he tried to ignore it, putting all his energy into pursuing McGuire up the garden towards the house. But he was so weak now, the wind almost had mastery of him, gusting through his form and catching the frayed entrails of his body. He looked like a war-torn flag, fouled so it was scarcely recognizable, just about ready to call it a day. Except McGuire. McGuire reached the house and slammed the door. The sheet pressed itself against the window, flapping ludicrously, its linen hands raking the glass, its almost lost face demanding vengeance. Let me in, it said. I will come in. McGuire stumbled backwards across the room into the hall. Raquel! Where was the woman? Raquel! Raquel! She wasn't in the kitchen. From the den, the sound of Tracy singing. He peered in. The little girl was alone. She was sitting in the middle of the floor, headphones clamped over her ears, singing along to some favorite song. Mummy, he minded her. Upstairs, she replied without taking off the headphones. Upstairs. As he climbed the stairs, he heard the dogs barking down the garden. What was it doing? What was the fucker doing? Raquel? His voice was so quiet he could barely hear it himself. It was as though he'd prematurely become a ghost in his own house. There was no noise on the landing. He stumbled into the brown-tiled bathroom and snapped on the light. It was flattering, and he always liked to look at himself in it. The mellow radiance dulled the edge of age, but now it refused to lie. His face was that of an old and haunted man. He flung open the airing cupboard and fumbled amongst the warm towels. There, a gun, nestling in scented comfort, hidden away for emergencies only. The contact made him salivate. He snatched the gun and checked on it, all in working order. This weapon had brought glass down once, and it could do it again, and again, and again. He opened the bedroom door. Raquel! She was sitting on the edge of the bed with Norton inserted between her legs. Both were still dressed, one of Raquel's sumptuous breasts teased from her bra and pressed into Norton's accommodating mouth. She looked round, dumb as ever, not knowing what she'd done. Without thinking, he'd fired. The bullet found her open-mouthed, gormless as ever, and blew a sizable hole in her neck. Norton pulled himself out, no necrophiliac he, and ran towards the window. Quite what he intended wasn't clear. Flight was possible. The next bullet caught Norton in the middle of the back and passed through his body, puncturing the window. Only then, with her lover dead, did Raquel topple back across the bed, her breasts splattered, her legs splayed wide. McGuire watched her fall. The domestic obscenity didn't disgust him. It was quite tolerable. Tit and mouth and blood and mouth, and lost love and all, it was quite tolerable. Maybe he was becoming insensitive. He dropped the gun. The dog stopped barking. He slipped out of the room into the landing, closing the door quietly so as not to disturb the child. Mustn't disturb the child. As he walked to the top of the stairs, he saw his daughter's winsome face staring up at him from the bottom. "Daddy?" He stared at her with a puzzled expression. "There was someone at the door. I saw them passing the window." He started to walk unsteadily down the stairs, one at a time. Slowly does it, he thought. "I opened the door, but there was nobody there." Wall. It must be Wall. He would know what to do for the best. Was it a tall man? "I didn't see him properly, Daddy. Just his face. He was even whiter than you." The door. Oh, Jesus, the door. If she'd left it open. Too late. The stranger came into the hall, and his face crinkled into a kind of smile, which McGuire thought was about the worst thing he'd ever seen. It wasn't Wall. Wall was flesh and blood. The visitor was a rag doll. Wall was a grim man. This one smiled. Wall was life and law and order. This thing wasn't. It was glass, of course. McGuire shook his head. The child, not seeing the thing wavering in the air behind her, misunderstood. "What did I do wrong?" she asked. Ronnie sailed past her on the stairs, more a shadow now than anything remotely manlike, shreds of cloth trailing behind him. McGuire had no time to resist, nor will left to do so. He opened his mouth to say something in defense of his life, and Ronnie thrust his remaining arm, wound into a rope of linen, down McGuire's throat. McGuire choked on it, but Ronnie snaked on past his protesting epiglottis, forging a rough way down his esophagus into McGuire's stomach. McGuire felt it there, a fullness that was like overeating, except that it squirmed in the middle of his body, raking his stomach wall and catching hold of the lining. It was all so quick, McGuire had no time to die of suffocation. In the event, he might have wished it go that way, horrid as it would have been. Instead, he felt Ronnie's hand convulse in his belly, digging deeper for a decent grip on his colon, on his duodenum. And when the hand had all it could hold, the fuckhead pulled out his arm. The exit was swift, but for McGuire the moment would seemingly have no end. He doubled up as the disemboweling began, feeling his viscera surge up his throat, turning himself inside out. His lights went out through his throat in a welter of fluids, coffee, blood, acid. Ronnie pulled on the guts and hauled McGuire, his empty torso collapsing on itself, towards the top of the stairs. Led by a length of his own entrails, McGuire reached the top stair and pitched forward. Ronnie relinquished his hold, and McGuire fell, head swathed in gut, to the bottom of the stairs, where his daughter stood still. She seemed, by her expression, not the least alarmed, but then Ronnie's new children could deceive so easily. The job completed, he began to totter down the stairs, uncoiling his arm and shaking his head as he tried to recover a smidgen of human appearance. The effort worked. By the time he reached the child at the bottom of the stairs, he was able to offer her something like a human touch. She didn't respond, and all he could do was leave and hope that in time she'd come to forget. Once he'd gone, Tracy went upstairs to find her mother. Raquel was unresponsive to her questions, as was the man on the carpet by the window. But there was something about them that fascinated her. A fat red snake pressing out of his trouser. It made her laugh. It was such a silly little thing. The little girl was still laughing when Wall of the Yard appeared, late as usual. Though viewing the death dances the house jumped to, he was, on the whole, glad he'd been a late arrival at that particular party. In the confessional of St. Mary Magdalene's, the shroud of Ronnie Glass was now corrupted beyond recognition. He had very little feeling in him, just the desire, so strong he knew he couldn't resist for very much longer, to let go of his wounded body. It had served him well, he had no complaints to make of it, and now he was out of breath. He could animate the inanimate no longer. He wanted to confess, though, wanted to confess so very badly, to tell the Father, to tell the Son, to tell the Holy Ghost what sins he'd performed, dreamt, longed for. There was only one thing in it for it. If Father Rooney wouldn't come to him, then he'd go to Father Rooney. He opened the door to the confessional. The church was almost empty. It was evening now, he guessed, and who had the time for lighting of candles when there was food to be cooked, love to be bought, life to be had? Only a Greek florist, praying in the aisle for her sons to be acquitted, saw this shroud stagger from the confessional towards the door of the vestry. It looked like some damn fool adolescent with a filthy sheet slung over his head. The florist hated that kind of godless behavior. Look where it had got his children. He wanted to beat the kid around a bit and teach him not to play silly beggars in the house of the Lord. "Hey, you!" he said, not too loudly. The shroud turned to look at the florist, its eyes like two holes pressed in warm dough. The face of the ghost was so woebegone it froze on the words of the florist's lips. Ronnie tried to handle the vestry door. The rattling got him nowhere. The door was locked. From inside, a breathless voice said, "Who is it?" It was Father Rooney speaking. Ronnie tried to reply, but no words would come. All he could do was rattle like any worthy ghost. "Who is it?" asked the good father again, a little impatiently. "Confess me," Ronnie wanted to say. "Confess me, for I have sinned." The door stayed shut. Inside, Father Rooney was busy. He was taking photographs for his private collection. His subject, a favorite lady of his by the name of Natalie, a daughter of Vice, somebody had told him. He couldn't believe that. She was too obliging, too cherubic, and she wound a rosary round her pert bosom as though she was barely out of a convent. The jiggling of the handle had stopped now. Good, thought Father Rooney. They'd come back, whoever they were. Nothing was that urgent. Father Rooney grinned at the woman. Natalie's lips pouted back. In the church, Ronnie held himself to the altar and genuflected. 3 rows back, the florist rose from his prayers, incensed by this desecration. The boy was obviously drunk. By the way he was reeling, the man wasn't about to be frightened by a tuppenny-colored death mask. Cursing the desecrator in ripe Greek, he snatched at the ghost as it knelt in front of the altar. There was nothing under the sheet. Nothing at all. The florist felt the living cloth twitch in his hand and dropped it with a tiny cry. Then he backed off down the aisle, crossing himself back and forth, like a demented widow. A few yards from the door in the church, he turned tail and ran. The shroud lay where the florist had dropped it. Ronnie, lingering in the creases, looked up from the crumpled heap at the splendor of the altar. It was radiant, even in the gloom of the candlelit interior, and moved by its beauty, he was content to put the illusion behind him. Unconfessed, but unfearful at judgment, his spirit crept away. After an hour or so, Father Rooney unbolted the vestry, escorted the chaste Natalie out of the church, and locked the front door. He peered into the confessional on his way back to check for hiding children. Empty, the entire church was empty. St. Mary Magdalene was a forgotten woman. As he meandered, whistling back to the vestry, he caught sight of Ronnie Glass's shroud. It lay sprawled on the altar steps, a forlorn pile of shabby cloth. Ideal, he thought, picking it up there. There were some indiscreet stains on the vestry floor, just the job to wipe them up. He sniffed the cloth. He loved to sniff. It smelt of 1,000 things: ether, sweat, dogs, entrails, blood, disinfectant, empty rooms, broken hearts, flowers, and loss. Fascinating. This was the thrill of the parish of Soho, he thought. Something new every day. Mysteries on the doorstep, the altar step. Crimes so numerous they would need an ocean of holy water to wash them out. Vice for sale in every corner if you knew where to look. He tucked the shroud under his arm. "I bet you've got a tale to tell," he said, snuffing out the votive candles with fingers too hot to feel the flame. That is Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud. I only read that one once. I'm not sure why it didn't stick out in my head. It was a pretty interesting story. And with today's technology, it would make a pretty good entry to a TV series, because they were supposed to do the Books of Blood TV series, but they said they didn't have enough money and turned it into the movie that they released last year on Hulu. Next week is Scapegoat. So thank you for reading with me, and I will see you next week. Bye.